welcome back to episode 2 of the Certes Once More Into the Breach podcast series. This week, we're going to be discussing the critical role of the C-suite in data protection.
Hello, my name is Paul German. I'm the Chief Executive here at Certes. I've been working with Certes around about 10 years. And when I came into the company, the company was tackling a problem that was really close to my heart, which was around solving the problem around data protection rather than focusing just purely on infrastructure. So a really very exciting place to be.
Thanks, Paul. Let's introduce your colleague. Your colleague is Simon Pamplin. Simon, welcome.
I've been with Certes for about 18 months now. And I joined really because the industry's come to a conclusion that the infrastructure in technology is really not fixing the big problem we have today. And that's data loss, people stealing your data. So Certes is a really interesting place to be because we're right on the forefront of learning how to protect that data for customers, no matter where it goes.
Protecting data in motion. And we understand from clients and customers that that data is going in lots of different directions. The question I have for you, let's look at a potential customer. What kind of pain are they in? Take us through that.
Again, interesting question because a lot of customers don't realize the liability that they carry just by owning and controlling data. So we have legally, there are two terms, data controller and data processor. Data controller being typically the customer that collects the data for running their business. Data processor is anybody that has the ability to touch that data from point A to point B. And that is a very wide legal definition on it. Now, the regulator pretty much states that if data is exposed to a third party that shouldn't have access to it, you're in breach of regulations such as GDPR or PCI or any of the other personal identifying information regulations around the world. They're all very, very similar. They're all built around the GDPR rules that we have in Europe and we've had in North America for a long time. And other countries are following suit, but they're adding on financial penalties. They're adding on, in some cases, prison sentences. So companies need to be aware that the data protection laws have really grown up. They've gone from being maybe a slap on the wrist and a small fine to 4% of global group revenue per breach. And if you're a large organization, that can be in the hundreds of thousands, millions, and in some very high profile cases has been in the billions of dollars per breach, per fine. But also there are prison sentences, and these prison sentences are aimed not just at the organization, they're aimed at the officers of the business. So the exec suite, the C-suite, the CEOs, CTO, CFO, etc. of the organizations. And they've been classed as being negligent in the way they handle and protect data. Now, there are many cases that you can go and Google. There's a very famous one in Finland with a company called Vastaama that was a psychotherapy company that had very good network security. Their CEO considered that was sufficient for protecting their data. Unfortunately, when they were hacked, not if, when they were hacked, they lost a lot of their customers' very sensitive data. Now, the CEO's excuse was, my IT security look after that. The regulator not only fined the organization heavily, but he levied a 3-month suspended jail sentence on the CEO for negligence in the way he carried out his duty. So the penalties are pretty punitive these days. And if you go and look at things like the Meta breach, so Facebook Meta, they had a data sovereignty breach. So no network breach, no hacker, no phishing attempt, nothing, no monitoring or analytics tool to pick this up. But they simply moved some data in an unprotected form from the European Union to North America. They were fined 4% of their global group revenue. And this is Meta Facebook, so a fairly large organization. And that resulted in a $1.3 billion fine, the single largest fine by the European GDPR regulators, for just moving data from one geography to another. Now, that is something that traditional network security could not and did not prevent, whereas Certes could have prevented that because we would have protected that data so it would have been unreadable by anyone in North America that it was moved to, and therefore would have complied with the regulation and no fine would have been levied. So organizations need to really take a strong look at the current regulations, how they manage and maintain and look after the data, and realize they have a duty of care over that data for the life of that data. And they may find that traditional network security is not focused on that, is only focused on the infrastructure. Data is the key thing. That's the thing the business is charged with looking after, not the infrastructure.
Is that because you have a number of different professionals operating in this space, Simon? don't have security in mind.
But this is where you need the different perspective. A traditional network security person will be focused on infrastructure security. And that's what most businesses think is going to protect them. But when you look at how data is stolen and the approach that people take, it's all about focusing on the data. So the approach from a business perspective has to be around protecting that data. That's the key thing. You've got to have that switch in focus from infrastructure to data.
Security, I find, are always the ones where you hear these conversations in boardrooms and in meetings where, oh, security always they're gonna tell us we can't do this, or we don't want security in this meeting because they're just gonna put holds on everything. And there's definitely a lack of alignment with both of those parties really needing to respect they need to work together. It's a cause for a lot of conflict, isn't it, in that space?
It absolutely is. And if you look in most businesses, there's kind of three tiers to a business. So we have the network infrastructure layer at the lower tier, them making sure that they keep the lights on, everything's flowing. Typically, they will have direction that is controlled by the security teams above them because they're looking after protecting that infrastructure. But above both of those tiers is the business requirements and the business needs, and they have to trump the security and the network because it's the business that is driving down the requirements that security and infrastructure have to implement, not the other way around.
You mentioned Meta just now. Meta's not the only significantly high profile case. I'm just going to read this excerpt here. And like you said, a lot of this information is open source. I'm going to talk about the SolarWinds and the new Securities and Exchange Commission regulation that came in place in January 2024. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced charges against Austin, Texas-based software company SolarWinds Corporation and its chief information security officer, we won't mention his name, for fraud and internal control failures relating to allegedly known cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities. The complaint alleges that from at least its October 2018 initial public offering through the 2020 announcement that it was the target of a massive, nearly 2-year-long cyber attack dubbed Sunburst. SolarWinds and Brown defrauded investors by overstating SolarWinds' cybersecurity practices and understating or failing to disclose known risks. Now, this is going to be and will always be one of the landmark cases of culpability and responsibility within certain positions of an organization. What kind of reassurance can you provide with Certes? I'm going to come over to Paul for this after you, Simon, but what kind of assurances can you provide now, knowing that these risks exist?
Yeah, and SolarWinds isn't the only one. I think Uber was also named in the same SEC Wells notice and notifications at the same time. What can we give to the CISOs? Well, if you look back at the regulations, it's all about was data exposed to people that shouldn't have had access to it. Just by putting Certes into the solution and we are transparent to anything else they've got deployed, we don't impact any of the existing solutions they've got in place. But crucially, we do protect that data, that data component on the network. So from the CISO's perspective, they can categorically answer that question to the regulators. No data was exposed to anyone that shouldn't have had access to it. Anyone that stole that data, it would have been worthless, meaningless, invisible to them. So that's the piece that we give back to the CISOs, that guarantee that you are going to protect that data through a Certes policy and nobody other than the intended recipient can access it.
And it's more than just providing a solution. It's like saying, do you know what? You're not even going to be having to have these conversations around transparency. So for a little bit of context, Microsoft came out, didn't they, very recently, and they said, we've also been subjected to Sunburst, the same as SolarWinds, but due to the SEC now requiring organizations to take responsibility and be transparent, we're out telling everybody that we're going to share what we've learned in this attack with other organizations so that hopefully this will support. Now, I know also there is the sharing of intel in relation to hostile threat actors, but Microsoft took a very important step here in saying we can't keep this as a secret anymore. We have to be transparent. So coming over to you, Paul, as a CEO, it's about reassuring your customers and potential customers, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the way you asked that question, Yo-Yo, is really very interesting because you mentioned about Microsoft there and them actively going out to the wider industry and sharing their experiences. And Simon Pamplin will talk more about this, but I feel that's more out of necessity than just willingness to actively go out to the market. And the reason I say that is because we have evidence out there now of the bad actors actually being very clear with those that they're holding ransom, that either the person under attack or the entity under attack actually goes public and notifies the data subjects of the breach and the regulators of the breach, or the bad actors will do it themselves. So it's a case of you tell them first before we tell them type mentality. So whilst I fully support all organizations that come under attack to go out to market or go out to the industry and publicize their learning so we can all learn from what's going on. Again, I think that the bad actors are really driving this behavior. So going back to the second part of your question about CEOs and how CEOs are keeping their organizations safe. The pressure from the regulators really is a high priority right now. We are talking about, if you get this wrong, then it's a case of the fines, the penalties, the implications could be actually damaging to your organization in such a way where your organization may not exist after such a compromise. Now, for years, we've been looking at, from a cyber risk perspective, we've been looking at cyber insurance as a way to mitigate our risk. But again, we're now seeing evidence where the cyber risk insurers are elevating premiums to a point of where almost unaffordable. Secondly, we're seeing caveats in those insurance policies that mean that customers of those insurers have to be able to demonstrate a clear method around how they've taken diligent steps to ensure that their data is protected according to the regulation needs that they have in front of them. So as a CEO, it's really very important that what we do is, we fully understand from a business perspective what the potential risks are around cyber risk, that we can quantify in terms of those both legal and monetary issues, but then also that we ensure that we're investing in the right places so that we can have people who really do understand these regulations, the way in which they need to be implemented. Surround ourselves with technologists who understand how best to utilize technology to mitigate risk in within our organizations, so that we can put ourselves in the best position possible to be protected against a data breach. Now, this is what's really important, and Simon touched on this earlier. There's no vendor out there that's going to be a silver bullet for any of these customers. We need to understand that even from a technology perspective, the technology always has to be implemented, and the implementors are typically the ones that follow best practice to make sure that a customer's data is protected at all times. Now, when it comes to Certes solution, what we've done is we've looked at concepts like zero trust. We've looked at the way that other technology vendors look at zero trust, and we've really drawn a line under it to say, actually, that's not meeting the requirements of our customers. Because when it comes to data protection, it's really very important that we understand the concepts of least privilege. And what I mean by that is that ownership is key. And when you're protecting your data, you need to make sure that only those that should have access to your data, or the policies and keys protecting that data, actually do have access to it. And Yo-Yo, you've made a couple of simplifying statements for our listeners. And I think it's really important. The way that I think about this is, it's like with my children. My kids are older teenagers now, but you get to a point where, you've got a key to the front door of your home, and your children start to go out on their own with their friends, and they get to a point where you're not always going to be home when they get home. So in essence, you need to give them a key to your front door. But what's really important is that you layer onto them exactly how important it is to keep that key safe. Because in the event that the keys are lost, then you have to go through a very painful process of replacing keys. But inevitably, before you replace those keys, somebody could get access to what is very sensitive to you, being your home. And this is the way we think about security when it comes to securing your data. We decouple that key ownership away from any of the components that we deploy. So that whether we're deployed as part of a managed service, or whether we're deployed internally, only those that should have access to those keys do get access to those keys. And therefore, we limit the scope of any breach. And what that means is, going back to your earlier question, is what that means is that when we stand in front of or when our customers are potentially breached, if they can demonstrate that they've put the protection of that data at a level of priority that demonstrates diligence to either the cyber risk insurers or to the regulators, then what it means is, and we heard this from a law firm that we're working with on some legal positioning papers, what they're saying is that the regulators will look on that more favorably than they would if an organization was just really throwing security to the wind and either relying on their cyber risk insurance or just saying, you know what, that's not a business issue, that's a technology issue, and leaving it to the technology teams who inevitably are very much infrastructure focused today, and therefore not deploying the correct controls or in the correct controls in the right way to put the organization in the best position possible to be protected. So as CEO, it's really very important that you take this holistic approach to how you are protecting what's sensitive to your business. And as much as we would put focus as CEOs on, let's say, our CFOs for accurately reporting the financial attributes of our businesses, it's now very important that we treat our chief risk officers, our data protection officers with the same level of focus that we do our CFOs, because reporting, adherence to regulations, management and understanding of risk is the same level of importance when it comes to data as it is to our financial reporting today.
It's important to ask why data protection sits with the C-suite.
Well, the answer to that is really very simple. If you get it wrong, it's very financially punitive to the organization, and now such that the fact that legal liability is being thrust upon the directors and officers within the organization, so people who sit within the C-suite. As an industry, I think the regulators have tried to make it of utmost importance to organizations for many years now. And now they're doing it the easy way for them, the hard way for us as individuals that sit within the C-suite, which is, again, very financially punitive to the organization if we get it wrong. And secondly, legal liability if we are seen to be negligent. So yeah, that's why it sits with the C-suite today.
We haven't really covered that reputational damage either, have we? We've talked about the financial penalties. We've talked about how many thousands of hours it can cost in a business's time alone just trying to fix things. But the reputational damage as a CEO it's got to be something to bear in mind, hasn't it?
Absolutely, it has. I think the first two, legal liability that sits with the C-level officers of the organization, and the financial damage, again, is so punitive. Obviously, as organizations that are selling products or services, it's really very important for our customers to have an element of trust within the brands that they buy from. So, yes, brand integrity is again of utmost importance, but I'll be honest with you, the regulators, I feel, have got a perfect storm. They've got the right mix of reputational damage through the way that they've structured regulations, such that data owners have to be notified in the event of a breach. You've then got, obviously, the knock-on effect that has financially through fines being levied onto organizations that are non-conformant or non-compliant. And then obviously we've got that legal liability with some regulations sits with the C-suite in the organization. So I think moving forward, we're going to see, and we're already starting to see, regulations and adherence to regulations being taken much more seriously at senior levels within organizations.
Thank you, Paul. I've noticed, certainly across my network, when I speak to people who are applying for jobs, Simon, they're checking that there is buy-in from the C-suite in relation to cybersecurity and investment into cybersecurity before they even commit themselves to the interviewing process. This is important, isn't it? What candidate wants to go and work for a company where there's no buy-in at the C-suite level, there's no investment, and the company has an apathetic view towards cybersecurity and data protection?
I think the problem is that the C-suite have largely detached themselves from the whole IT sphere. They consider there's a group in their business that deal with it and they don't need to worry about it. If you went to them and said, would you like to carry more risk as a business, or would you like to carry less risk as a business? And how would that affect your earnings per share? That's talking their language. That's speaking to them, their board members, the people they report to. So it becomes much more and relevant to them. Now, this is where our DPRM solution talks to the business in business language rather than technology speak, if you like. So we try and make sure that what we're talking about with regards to the whole risk in cybersecurity is put in the context of how it's going to affect them and their business that they're charged with looking after. Because if they don't look after it, they get charged with being negligent. And then there's a whole world of pain that follows that, including loss of their own jobs. So when we go and talk to a business and we're looking at this, how do they approach security? How uppermost is it in their mind? That's a really key thing. I think most businesses have detached themselves from security. They have a security department that they've their responsibility to. The problem for them is that regulators don't look at it that way. They look at a business and their entire responsibility. So if you were going to go and join a company and you were looking at their stance on security, it's really more than security. It's about the whole way they think about their business and how they go about managing, running, dealing with the actions of that business. And it changes and it varies for different verticals. But fundamentally, this is now being pushed right up the stack to the CEOs. And it's saying you're responsible for everything that happens in this business, including, and probably more importantly, the data that you're responsible for. So it is starting to work its way up there. But it's something that for far too long, CEOs have gone, well, you're talking security. I have a security department. Go and talk to them. That's no longer good enough.
Yeah, because if you were to relate that to health and safety, you couldn't really have a CEO saying, I've got a health and safety guy. He manages all of our business's health and safety. I think we've almost got to start looking at cybersecurity and data protection in the same way, in that it's everybody's responsibility. Data security, we know, sits at the C-suite level. And I think we're going to see an awful lot more responsibility at that level, a lot more ownership, even designated people. So we know at the moment a DPO has a designated line of authority to the board. I can see more developments in this area, and I think it's nothing but good because, let's face it, the board, they don't really specialize in security. They don't specialize in data security and privacy and protection, do they? So it's quite a hard job sometimes convincing a board of their roles and responsibilities. Have you had to do that?
We do. What we do is we deal with it in the context of business risk. And if you go and talk to any board member, any shareholder, the last thing they want to hear about is that your company is taking on more risk, because that obviously is going to have an impact on their earnings per share and have financial impacts to them personally. So when you look at this in the context of business risk, it resonates far better. And you're absolutely right. I can see this becoming, in 2024, the leading security issue of how do you protect an organization from the risk from data loss. So forget concepts like cybersecurity and network security. They muddy the waters and make it sound like just an IT problem. This is a business problem that is going to actually affect the board members, the shareholders, and the customers, as well as all of the IT infrastructure.
To your point earlier, there's a lot of scaremongering going on, certainly around high numbers being bandied around in the industry around the financial losses, the number of attackers, the number of threats a business can be facing every day. And it's very difficult sometimes for skeptics to see the wood for the trees, certainly in relation to the data that's available. You mentioned earlier about Meta. It's almost sometimes, I think, a relief to see large companies being held to task for these huge problems around data mismanagement. For the other organizations to realize what we're saying, we're not just harbingers of doom, we're actually saying this is a real and present danger to your data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think it was last week I was presenting to a group of managed service provider companies. And I went through our usual discussion around risk and impact, etc. And it started off with them shaking their heads at being disbelieving. So I gave them an example of a telecoms company in Greece that was fined. I think they were fined €6 million for a data breach. And the regulator decided that their infrastructure provider, their managed service provider, was equally or just slightly less culpable and gave them just over a €3 million fine for not protecting the infrastructure that was carrying that data. That's when the penny dropped with these service providers, and they realized that it might feel like scaremongering. It might feel like we're the harbingers of doom, but what we're actually doing is pointing out to people, this is reality. This is law. This is not something that's hearsay or rumor or conjecture. This is law. And this is something that you will fall foul of if you don't take these protective measures. And that's where Certes comes into this whole place with our DPRM solution.
Thank you so much, Simon. We've discussed in this podcast why it's important the C-suite is accountable. And who better than these two fine gentlemen at Certes, Simon, Pamplin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Yo-Yo. Yeah, it's a really important subject. The exec level or the C-suite really need to wake up to the fact that they are going to have some very large penalties impacting their business if they don't focus on protecting the data that they're charged with being responsible for.
Thank you so much. And who better than our very own CEO himself, sitting on his own C-suite? He knows more than most why it's important to have that accountability. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yo-Yo. And what I would say is, being a CEO myself, I fully understand and appreciate the pressure on my shoulders around meeting both the current and the upcoming regulatory pressures that we have out there. So I would encourage, if you sit within the C-suite, look, it's not somebody else's problem. It's your problem to get this solved. So you need to fully understand, where does regulation fit or sit within your organization? I would encourage you to make sure you surround yourself with good people so that you can fully understand and ascertain the risks that sit within your organization when it comes to regulatory compliance.
So that's it for today. Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Paul. Let me tell you a little bit about episode 3. Episode 3 is about decrypting zero trust, separating fact from fiction in data security. You don't want to miss that. See you then.